Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Fine Arts Work Center. My name is Sharon Poley, and I am the Executive Director, and I am so delighted to welcome both our in-person audience tonight and our Zoom audience. Thank you all for joining us for the second event in our series, Opening to Wonder, Craft Talks on Poetry. The Opening to Wonder series was created by a group of volunteer faculty and fellows of the Fine Arts Work Center in order to raise critical support during the pandemic for our institution. And we are so grateful to Marie Howe, Nick Flynn, and Victoria Riddell for their leadership in curating the series. Past Opening to Wonder presenters included Walter Mosley, Carolyn Forche, Susan Choi, Michael Cunningham, Terrence Hayes, and Ross Gay, among many others. In celebration of National Poetry Month and the critical role that poets and poetry play in our society, we are thrilled to once again present this beloved series. We continue our programming tonight with nationally recognized poet Pádraig Ó Tuama, introduced by dear friend of the Work Center, Marie Howe. Next week, we hope you'll return. We'll be hosting Ada Limon, as well as Nick Flynn, on Thursday, April 21st. You can learn more about this series by visiting us online and register at www.foc.org. It is more than fitting that we present this conversation and craft talk tonight live from the Stanley Kunitz Common Room, named in honor of Work Center founder and Poet Laureate of the United States twice. Stanley, together with a group of artists and writers, envisioned a creative home in Provincetown where emerging artists and writers could live together in community and focus on new directions in their work. The Work Center has dedicated ourselves to this mission for more than 50 years. Our signature program is our renowned 7-month fellowship in which 10 emerging writers and 10 emerging artists come together to live here in community. We are so pleased to welcome many of our fellows here with us tonight, and all funds raised through this series and throughout the month of April will support our signature fellowship program. So thank you everyone here tonight who helped contribute. Our goal is to raise $20,000 by April 30th, and we are more than halfway there. Thank you. If you're inspired to give tonight, please just visit us on our website. A gift in any amount is truly meaningful and hugely appreciated. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. For those of you joining us virtually, tonight's format is a Zoom meeting. Our colleague Magdalene is available on Zoom tonight to help facilitate your experience. We invite you to have your cameras on or off, depending on your comfort level. There will be a Q&A following this evening's conversation, reading, and craft talk, so participants will have the opportunity to engage in really meaningful dialogue with our featured guests. There are books available for sale by our partner, beloved independent local bookstore East End Books, and you can also purchase them online at eastendbooksptown.com. So, it's now my pleasure, without any further ado, to introduce Marie Howe, trustee, fellow, and honored guest tonight. Thank you.
And Pádraig, yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to see you all. You're all wearing your masks. And we're not doing that in groups anymore in New York, so there's probably people here I know, but I can't see you. Can I just ask if there are any fellows here? Could you just raise your hand? Because we're so eager to see you and to meet you, especially. Thank you so much. My name is Marie. I was a fellow here in 1983, and Stanley was such a good friend for 25 years, and I was actually here when this room was dedicated to him, when it was first constructed, and now we're in this new, fancy, amazing room. I'm so happy to be here with Pádraig Ó Tuama, who's a dear friend. Pádraig Ó Tuama is a poet, he is a theologian, and he worked for many years running a Corrymeela, which was Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community. He's written so many books. He's written, we have the book in back called, is it Prayers for Corrymeela? Daily Prayers for Corrymeela. He wrote readings from the book, I lost my page, here I am. He wrote a book called Sorry for Your Troubles, a book called Readings from the Book of Exile, a wonderful book called In the Shelter, Finding a Home in the World. And together with his friend Glenn Jordan, a book called Borders and Belonging. His next book of poetry called Feed the Beast is coming out in December. And some of you may have heard his podcast, Poetry Unbound, which is affiliated with Krista Tippett's On Being podcast. And from Poetry Unbound, an anthology of 50 poems is coming out. And it's called Poetry Unbound, 50 Poems to Open Your World. I wanted so much to bring Pádraig here to the Work Center. This is a second home to me, and this community means so much to me because he stands at the intersection of theology, conflict resolution, and poetry. And so he's going to read some poems to us and talk, and then we can all talk. And I really hope the fellows will engage with us, especially because you're here. And so I would like to introduce my dear friend. I have to say, Pádraig and his partner, Paul Doran, were married 2 days ago. So where's Paul? Paul? So the newlywed, one of them.
So thank you very much for that warm welcome, Marie. And it's a real honor to be here. I am thrilled. I've heard about the Fine Arts Work Center for many years, and it's a real honor to be able to read some poems and to be in conversation together about poetry and craft and art. I am going to read pretty much all new poems tonight. I suppose I'm interested in thinking tonight when it comes to poetry. How can you have poetry that's in conversation with your other interests in the world, as well as poetry that's in conversation with mythology? As Marie said, I trained in theology. I've done too much theology, more theology than is decent. I should stop, really. So here's a poem called The Death of Eve, who is in the mythology understood to be the first woman. The Death of Eve. On the first day, God began splitting things, so accidentally invented time. The angels were gathered in little groups, even though it was forbidden, and said things like, "Remember when death and life were the same? Remember the language of trees? Remember love before hate became its own thing? Remember boredom?" God said remembering was just for Sundays, but people were already beginning to ignore him. "Remember God," they said. This was before clocks or maps or dictionaries of etymology, but it was after the first prayer. The day Eve died, the sun stayed low in the sky. Adam stared out the window at the long shadows and started making calendars. Evening came, then morning. Suddenly everyone was talking about time. "Remember when I was young?" the child said, and everybody smiled. "Remember the garden?" Eve had said, and people wished she'd be quiet. "Remember when the old woman spoke and we thought she knew nothing?" someone said a few years later. Eve was in the ground by then. They brought angel feathers to the grave. The first time that it got dark in winter, Eve thought that time was going backwards. She'd wake up early to check if the stars had disappeared or if gills had reappeared on the necks of horses. She watched for returning chaos and shooed every bird away to safety. What if all this ends, she said, looking back and looking forward, looking around. In the end, her worry didn't matter. Days arrived where nights had seemed to stay. The next time it happened, she mapped out a pattern. The third time she understood. Then she saw circles everywhere, in seasons, in the passage of the skies, in Adam's eye. Remember when we were younger, she said, walking among the trees. There is an old midrash trying to figure out about what it was like when the days began to get shorter and the nights began to get longer. And the midrash, which is kind of like a Hebrew psychoanalysis of the text, poking holes in the spaces between words in the text of the Bible. The midrash suggests that Adam thought that time was turning backwards, which is such an interesting imagination about time. And it shows that what we might call a metaphysic of time has been operating in human community long before we had the phrase metaphysic of time, and that people have understood that time is a malleable and a strange thing for as long as there have been stories, and longer. I'm going to read from a new sequence. The sequence is called In a Garden by a Gate. And this sequence takes two mythological characters. And for the purposes of understanding what I'm really on about, you can understand that both of these mythological characters are me. And I'm just projecting into them, absolutely, with both shame and no shame. And the two mythological characters that are taken are Jesus of Nazareth and Persephone. And you might know one or both or neither of those. Jesus of Nazareth is the center of the imagination of Christianity. And there are all kinds of theories of understanding who he is. God's son, one of which is that, at the crucifixion, which is marked on Good Friday tomorrow, he went to hell to redeem the souls or something. Nobody really knows, even in theology, what was supposed to have happened in hell. There's all different kinds of ideas. And I've been fascinated by hell for a very long time. I'm gay and was put through exorcisms for the devils in me when I was a teenager. And it gave me an obsession, really, about the devil and hell. And so I suppose I needed to study theology to exercise myself a little bit. And the other character in this sequence of poems is called Persephone. And she, in Greek mythology, is the daughter of Demeter, who is the goddess of agriculture. And so the legend goes, every year Persephone goes down to Hades, and Demeter weeps and winter happens because agriculture begins to mourn, and so everything dies. And then when Persephone comes out of Hades, the underworld, in the springtime, spring erupts because Demeter, her mother, the goddess of agriculture, is glad to have her daughter back. And in this sequence, Persephone is leaving the gates of Hades, as she does every year, and she's pushing the gate open, and she turns around and sees this bedraggled character limping out behind her. And I'll read you a few of these. They have a conversation. This is by way of an introduction. Once upon a time, there was a man who went to hell. When he'd been there some time, he found that what he thought was a way out, a long tunnel. He dragged himself through it. It seemed to last, a decade. Someone was ahead of him. He wasn't sure if she'd always been there or if she'd come from somewhere. Anyway, she didn't look back. He couldn't remember if he slept or woke, if he stopped. Nobody helped. Once he woke up to the sound of water trickling down, offerings from above. Once he saw hares running backwards and forwards, busy with messages and tasks. He felt before he saw the light. "Is that morning?" he shouted. Well, he says he shouted. He began forgetting as soon as he began remembering. There was the smell of a garden in the air, and eventually he saw the gate, small, heavy. She had opened it and was standing by it, still facing away, waiting for him now. Every inch was a mile. The air was fresh. It smelt like early spring. He stumbled past her, fell, felt the dew on his face where he laid down. He licked his lips. "I heard you behind me," she said. "I wondered who you were." "Why didn't you turn back?" he asked. It doesn't work like that, she said. How did you find the way? Which way, he said. To the gate, she said. To the garden. Here's a poem called Who Do You Say That I Am? Who do you say that I am? What's your name, she said. Joshua, he said, and she laughed. He said, what? She said, a friend of mine taught children in the village school. She said that the Joshuas were always little shits. She was right, he said, we were. When I was alive, I thought I knew the sun and stars and moon. Did you? She asked. I just said I did, he said. No, she said, did you? Did you know them really? Yes, he said, I did. Me too, she said. It's never easy when you see the things that other people don't. How old are you? He asked. I've seen 100 summers, she said. How about winters? He replied, joking. Only a few, she said. And you? I'm young, he said, 32 or 33, depending on the calendar you use. So I've seen all the seasons. Which one's your favorite? She asked. He thought a while. I used to like the spring, he said, but now autumn is my season. You see everything anew when it's about to die. I've worked in conflict resolution for a long time, as Marie said, and so much about conflict resolution is about being over-prepared and then abandoning everything when you get into the room. And that's a courtesy, because you never want to come in not having a clue, because people in the room have been bereaved through murder. People in the room have been bereaved through terrible trauma. People are carrying the weight of history, the weight of colonization, the weight of the impact of the disempowerment of language and everything like that. But you're also wanting to create a situation in a room where somehow the cadence of everyday conversation can be the possibility of something that might feel a little bit more grounded than everyday conversation. It is heavy and light all at once. You know that yourself, I know, in times of grief. In times of grief, suddenly you're saying things that are light and heavy all at the same time. So so every one of these poems is based on a dialogue between this Persephone and this Jesus. They ask each other questions. And I suppose really the question is what are the things that are underneath the questions that's really happening? And that's true in life as well as in poetry. Did any of you ever read the book, The 5 Love Languages? It's a terrible book. You shouldn't read it. It proposes that there's only 5 love languages, and I always get them wrong. Words of affirmation, touch, gifts, and a couple of other things. You read a book, you answer the questions, you turn to the back, you tot it up, and then it tells you who you are. Amazing. We should all have read it when we were 5. So Jesus has been reading that, and Persephone is unimpressed. This poem is called The Book of Revelation. What's your love language, he asked. Hunger, she replied. No, he said, there's 5. There's words of affirmation, touch, and gifts, and time, and I forget the 5th. I know it rhymes with purpose. Where do you get this shit, she said. Anyway, all of them, and more. Hunger too, and things I don't have the words for. It doesn't work like that, he said. In the book, you answer 50 questions and get results by turning to the end. What's with you and certitude, she said. Come on, just play along, he said. Which one's yours? Words or touch or time or gifts or acts of service? That's the 5th. Told you. Kind of rhymes with purpose. Did you have kids? She said. Of course I did, he said. I loved them. How? She said. With words or touch or time or gifts or little piles of knickers, jocks and socks left laundered on the landing? Okay, you've made your point, he said. If you want to know, mine's words of affirmation. I know, she said. I bet you yours is time, he said. Why? She replied. I'm doing a PhD at the moment in poetry and prayer and the overlap between the two, and these poems are part of that. So here's one called Prayer. Is that a nightingale? He asked. A song thrush, she replied. How can you tell? She sings everything twice, she said. She is her song's own echo, speaking and repeating, listening, listening back. They often gather at the gates, little soloists to charm what's underneath. Their notes trill through corridors. In the beginning, I would listen for them when I couldn't find my way. I'd hear their phrases bouncing against the walls, harmonizing with themselves. Sometimes I'd sing back. There are tropes, and remember, a trope isn't necessarily something that is untrue. A trope is something that's so true that we aren't entirely sure how to say it. And so it can seem like a motivational poster you stick up on the wall and you hate it because of that, but nonetheless there's something in it. And it is a trope that remembering is important in the process of healing. But you know yourself when you've been in trauma that sometimes remembering is a deeper torture. And so how to hold the question of remembering together is a complicated one. So here's a poem called On the Nature of Forgetting. I should say that the character of Jesus of Nazareth in the literature was scourged with a whip before he was then crucified, which is a terrible, terrible torture, and died. And so this character who comes out from Hades is wounded. On the nature of forgetting. She'd seen his wounds. Who couldn't? But she knew she shouldn't ask until he'd settled down a little. So she watched, waited, saw how he always kept his knees a little bent while he was standing, keeping balance on the front part of his feet, muscles of his ass and thighs a little tense, always eyes in the horizon, planning an escape. She looked at his bare back, his side, his mangled ankles, his chest gasping like he couldn't take much breath and needed to take more breath. Who did this to you? She said at last. I forget, he said. Forget or won't remember, she asked. Is there a difference, he said. Yes, she said. I can see you need to talk. So tell me, if not me, anyone, anything, the sky, the earth, a fucking tree. Can't, he said. Don't want to either. Often, I think trauma manifests itself, and you'd see this in situations of conflict resolution where you choose the safest person upon whom to unload the heaviest trauma. So here's a poem called These Three Remain. Do you have hope, she asked. In what, he said. Hope in hope, she said. Come on, I know you understand me. It's the one I miss the most, he said. I don't need faith. And love, well, I've begun to reassess. But hope, I used to think it was a little clock, wound up by the corners of the universe, tuned to stories that the nighttime sings. And then I thought, no, hope is a muscle. Then I thought it was a song. When everything was ending, I said a little prayer back to myself, one I'd learnt at school, a prayer to say at night when you're afraid, the teacher had said. I copied it in my book, and soon I didn't need the words. It never felt so empty than when I realized it was empty. She looked, said nothing, heard the rush of words, understood that he was at the edge. Your name means destruction, doesn't it, he said. I remember that from lessons too. What does that mean? And where were you when everything started? What does it feel like, she said, moving closer. Don't touch me, he said. Then he said, it feels like I've just been born, and I don't like the world I'm in, and I don't know who you are. I just know that everything I believed in is nothing now. The God I said I loved plucked me like a golden apple, let me rot in the corner of his garden. He said I'd be prized, said I'd establish a kingdom of wisdom and of love. Look at me now, cold on whatever day this is, hungry too. I'll search for berries later. I'll drink water from the mountain stream. It will taste of heaven and sheep's piss. I'm forgotten, he said, wondering if it's worth the effort to continue. Is it? She said. Worth the effort to continue? He looked at her, made a noise like laughter or a bark. "Who's asking?" he said. "I know you want to know what happened to me. I want to know some things too, like who are you? How come you found me? Were you waiting for me? Were you bait? Is this a game? If I tell you everything, will you explode in front of me like everything has exploded in front of me? Are you a friend at all? Are you a bomb?" "Can I be both?" she asked. I'll just read two more. You know, sometimes you wonder, how am I going to tell people the story of something difficult if you've been through something difficult? And you wonder and wonder about that. And then you realize you don't have to wonder too much, because mostly people just want to talk about themselves rather than hear you. So Persephone knows this. So here's a poem called "Where Have You Been?" "When people ask you where you've been, what do you say?" he said. "I say I've been to hell and back," she said. And they say, "Christ, me too." Then they tell me all their troubles and their pains, and they expect their tale of woe is shocking. So they reassure me not to worry, nothing that a burger and a bottle every evening couldn't cure. They pick up their phones, they carry on. Sometimes they might ask if I'm okay after everything they've told me. I smile and tell them I'm okay. Then they feel okay. They never ask for more. "But you," he said, "what do you say? What story do you tell about how, about who, about all the things that happened on the way?" "You're new to this," she said. "You have so much time. You'll tell it one way to your friends today, and in time you'll find that it's changed. Some days it's fine. Other days it's like you're back there, can't escape. Then spring surprises you and everything's all right. Then winter after summer. Then it's back again. You see new things. You learn. You find others who understand without being told. It's in their silence. It's in the way they hold themselves while listening to you, by watching you. You come to recognize the way they listen by their eyes." Here's the last one, called "Do You Believe in God?" "Do you believe in God after everything you've been through?" she asked. "I'm not sure," he said. "Do you?" "Not like I used to," she replied. "I grew up thinking God was light. Then I went to where there was no light. I used to think that God made all things new, but I've been wandering a while now, and I see nothing new. Everything's a lens through which another everything can be viewed. That screws you up and releases you. I look at dawn now and love the turning, the way that morning blue is both dead and new. How about you?" "I love the night," he said. She looked and asked, "Is that your answer as to whether there's a God?" "It's all I've got," he said. "I'm not trying to be obscure. I keep looking for what's true." "I know you do," she said. "Me too." Thanks. I think we might talk a little bit, but I think for me, I was embarrassed for a long time by my interest in religion and burdened by my interest in religion too. But partly one of the things that has helped is that any religious literature is a study in archetype. And I found when I could separate myself from the burden of religion as it had been on me, I found myself curious about this archetype of this Jesus of Nazareth character. And I thought, in order to take him seriously, I have to take him really seriously. And I began to write some sonnets about him. And I sent some of those sonnets around to a few friends to say, "What do you think?" One of whom was Spencer Rees. Some of you will know Spencer's work. And Spencer wrote back and said, "Write them in the first person." That was it, done. And I was kind of annoyed. It was like, A, that's probably blasphemy. And B, did you not read them more? Like, I want to hear what you liked in it, rather than, writing these. I had been writing these sonnets in the third person. But it stuck with me. It kind of got under my skin, a little bit like an irritation. And I suppose I thought, well, from the point of view of art, to take these characters seriously, what would it be like to shape an I from them? And to see them change in the face of a you. Martin Buber writes about the I-thou relationship, and that facing a you can open us up into this experience of exchange. And I was interested to think about what would human encounter look like between these two mythological characters, one of whom had only been recently introduced to hell, and the other goes there every year. And how does that speak to the question of places like Belfast, where Paul and I live, where people are recovering from long-standing trauma, and where just because a peace agreement was signed 25 years ago, that means it's only the beginning of peace rather than the achievement of it. Of course, we think of Ukraine and think of Yemen and so many other places around the world where we hope for peace agreements, but we must know that those are the beginning of something, not the arrival at it. And the ways within which I suppose the interests in trauma and conflict come out in this, and dialogue, as well as the ways within which there's no real mechanism to try to heal. You hope it can happen in the kinds of conversations and friendships that are being manifested here. There are so many people's voices being manifested in Persephone particularly, and I think my own naivety is being manifested in the Jesus voice in this, because he was kind of addicted to purpose and certitude, and he is coming away from such an addiction and beginning to think, is there no meaning now? And he's meeting people to say, no, there's not, but here's how to live a life. And Persephone knows that better than he does in these characterizations. So I'd love to have a conversation. There's other poems I can read too. Not everything is about Persephone or Jesus, you'll be glad to know. But I would love to talk with you about whatever's on your mind from these, whatever projections you have into the projections that I've just shared with you. And we take some questions and have conversation. I think this one's on.
Hello. I've heard these before, but when you read them right now, I just feel devastated.
Really?
Yeah. How do you all feel? Really? What? Not describable with the sound. Well, there it is. Not describable with the sound.
Huh.
Because they come to the edge of speech. That's
They
where
do.
they get marooned there,
Yeah.
right? And they're so intimate, and they're also so testy with each other.
Yeah.
That she knows him more than he knows himself in a way. But how? Because she recognizes him.
Totally. I mean, I for a long time I was poet in residence for dialogue groups of people who'd been through terrible suffering during the Troubles. And my job was to help co-facilitate a session and then to write a poem during the week to come back, not for publication, but a poem that would in a certain sense be a listening and a reframing and a supporting of the emotional cadence of what had been said. And one week I went back to a group who'd been describing living through the Troubles, and I read the poem and somebody says, it doesn't say fuck enough. And I loved the wisdom of that because there was great humor in it, but there was also something to say, if we're talking about the end of the world, I need to recognize the end of the world in this. And I'm always interested in that edge of things where language is failing and where hopefully language is very simple. I don't think there's too many complicated words in these. And none of the questions they're asking are obscure. They're quite deliberate. And I think those are some of the questions with humor and with, I think, a testy kind of playfulness. Those are the kinds of things that I've recognized from decades now at this stage of working with groups who've been coming out of trauma, is that what you're looking for is the place where both of those things can happen at once. And often people who are in the trauma come away hearing more of the humor and the warmth than the devastation, because they know the devastation. They don't need to be, that's not a shock to them. What's nice is that they can talk about it with a certain levity.
You know, you and I both love Midrash.
We do.
And, I'm sure there are some people here who know Midrash is, well, you could explain it better. It's a Jewish tradition of reading in the Torah is a living document that is never finished. So when you read what some of us grew up calling the Old Testament, and you imagine yourself as the characters or in between, like what did Isaac do the day after his father almost killed him? What did Adam and Eve do the first day they were exiled from the garden? You sort of imagine these things, and it's not only allowed, but it's encouraged. And then there's so many previous imaginations, you learn them too throughout history, so it builds into this parallel stories. Now, Persephone's hell is very different from Jesus's hell.
Yeah.
She had a goddess mother, and she had the Greek gods, which were such a different set of god-like creatures, different from the Judeo god, although not all that different when I come to think of it.
Yeah.
And then you've got Jesus, who has actually feels like he's shipwrecked on this meaninglessness. And I found that just existentially frightening up here today.
But I think that's part of it. I mean, I was so committed to certitude myself, or not committed to it. I was told it was the only option, and I had to find my way out of it. And so, I mean, I don't think the Jesus character here is a full representation of me, but certainly I put parts of me into him. You mentioned there's a book called Borders and Belonging. Myself and a close friend, Glenn Jordan, wrote a book looking at the Book of Ruth, the Hebrew Book of Ruth. I love that book as a commentary on Brexit, because it's a fascinating it's a fascinating exploration of borders and belonging. And Book of Ruth is not about charity. The Book of Ruth is about Ruth arriving as a widowed, displaced border crosser into a community, embodying the law in herself and in the position of judge because she holds her own integrity and she doesn't bow down. She's extraordinary. And Glenn died the day that we submitted that text for publications, just at the start of COVID. He was young, 56. And I had known Glenn since I was 11. I loved him. And I think the sense, and we all know this, there's certain deaths that happen and you're just plunged into your own hell. And you think, I don't care if spring's coming back. I don't care if the sun is shining. And for me, part of the exploration of this is what I would insist is a certain kind of joy in the melancholy of these poems, because they're talking, they're bantering back and forth, they're doing it. They're doing the work of searching for some kind of myth that can work. And she is deepening her own knowledge of herself by seeing somebody who's further back than she was. And I wonder, would she have those stories to say to herself if she wasn't in dialogue? And that, for me, is a way within which the meaninglessness is being supported in encounter. And to my mind, that is certainly the journey I've come on, from belief to encounter, when it comes to the question of what does it mean to be alive.
Well, they're so intimate. They talk so intimately with each other, although they don't know each other really.
Yeah.
But they recognize each other.
That's what happens in groups. I mean, so many groups that gather around a shared need or a shared devastation.
Sure.
There is a language of community and intimacy, which is surprising. And
well, AA meetings, like, they ring with laughter, right? I mean, because everybody feels like, yeah, you know. You can tell the saddest story you've got, and people are like, yeah, I know. And then I killed the dog. You killed the dog. But it's there. It's like this recognition that not only it all happened, but we're here, we're alive, we're here, and we're together.
And we're telling it.
And we're telling it.
Yeah.
And in the telling, but what's fascinating is that the poems, which are so beautiful, and that one about Eve, I mean, come on, too. It's just my favorite. Which everybody's disobeying, everybody. I mean, the angels gathered, although they weren't supposed to gather, and they were all whispering, and everyone is so subversive, you know. But they're trying to tell it, but they can't tell it. And they can't tell it because they can't remember the trauma, or, but then they do, but they don't.
They feel like a failure too, and I think that's one of the things that certainly has plagued my life, has been feeling constantly like I'm a failure. And
in what way?
In every way. I mean, I said to a friend once when I was 19, I woke up this morning and didn't feel any guilt. And he was like, why would you feel guilt? And I was like, what planet did you grow up on? You know.
Well, I remember going to Al-Anon meetings for weeks and months and months and months, and I would sit there and everybody was always talking about fear. The fear. I'm like, what is this fear? And what is wrong with these people? And then suddenly, I remember where I was sitting. I was on a windowsill in Cambridge. Oh my God, I shouldn't be talking about this. It's an anonymous program. But anyway, all of a sudden, I went, wait a minute. And I raised my hand. And I said, my name is Marie. Is it possible that what you're calling fear is the atmosphere I have been living in all my life? And that when it's really high, it's a terrible day. When it's a little lower, it's a better day. And everybody burst into laughter. And because I didn't even recognize
You
it.
didn't know what life was like without fear.
I didn't know
Yeah.
it was the element I lived in.
Yeah.
And wow, was that a big day.
And that's the thing, is that it's devastating and joyous at once.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Irish tradition in music, some of our most sweetest airs or melodies are laments.
Broken hearts,
Yeah,
broken-hearted.
And that's, I think that, like, Turlough O'Carolan is a 17th century blind harpist, and his most beautiful piece is his Farewell to Music. He was shortly before he died, and he composed this stunning lament in about 1730, and he died, I think, in that year. This stunning lament as he was taking leave of the language that had been his. He was a prodigy on the harp. And so there's something, I think, that I find great hope in and great joy in realizing that somehow art in conversation with lament is itself a certain kind of meaning making.
A liberation.
It's a liberation, and there is an uplifting nature to it, because then when it comes, you can say, I know what to do here. Not to conquer it, it'll probably conquer you, but to say art is in conversation with this.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that art is not, is, I suppose, that is a terrible edge that we can be brought to. But always, I think, all of us as artists hope that somehow being brought to the edges that we're being brought to, that there will be some form of art that can support us, and by going into the particular of that, it might make some kind of connection.
Who was it who said, was it Paul? It wasn't Paul Celan, who said after what we call the Holocaust, poetry was over.
Yeah.
And yet Paul Celan tried to use the German language again
he refused
to make poems. Yeah.
He refused to write in any other language. He just
Yeah.
stayed writing in German
Yeah.
as a certain act of art
Yeah.
and hope. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Even though there was so much silence in those poems.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's more silence than utterance. It's funny when you were saying about writing into these archetypes, and one of them being a theological. They're both theological.
Yeah.
I have to confess that I said to Pádraig about a week ago on the phone, now this is the work center. It's a secular audience, And like 2 days later, I'm like, what was I thinking? And I realized that I was embarrassed about my own interest in these stories and in these archetypes myself, and that I was projecting it onto you, and I apologize later. But it's fascinating how much religion, if you will, has made I've been embarrassed all my life by my deep interest in these stories.
Yeah.
And slowly, I'm less and less so.
Yeah. I mean, the less I've believed in heaven, the more interested I've become in the characters that you encounter in sacred texts, because they are. Now, I've got a sequence of poems loosely. I mean, some of these will be in it, called "Fucked Up Families of the Bible," and partly it was a kind of a desire, especially in the anti-gay marriage campaign that went on all across the world, really, and continues to go on in places. And forget gay marriage, homophobic laws, really, in so many places. I hear so often people saying, well, biblical family values, and like I have done too much study in the Bible, and part of me wants to say, have you read the damn thing? Like, my God, find a single family in there who you would want to go, oh, I'd like my family to be like that. My God, you need therapy. And the texts, that's one of the things that's so interesting, is that these texts, when you can look at them without the burden of dogma, these texts are so interesting. And you recognize the different versions of God that are competing against each other. You recognize that the prophets, I think, would have hated each other if you put them all in the same room. They had different political imaginations about what the community should be and what the rules should be. And therefore you go, it sounds just like a political campaign today. And you realize that the sophistication of the authors and the art of these authors that you find in the Bible is deep and real and powerful and risky, and so many of them were persecuted for what they were writing. And therefore I only really see the Bible as art, and I respect the artists who were writing stuff that was causing them sometimes to be put to death or thrown down wells to starve to death. That's what the prophet Jeremiah was, what's what happened to him. He wrote then one of his laments, speaking to God, "You are to me a deceiving stream, and I curse the day when I was born." Extraordinary. These brilliant poets are worthy of being praised. I don't give a damn if people do or don't believe in God. I don't know if I do or don't. What I know is that I'm possessed by a curiosity about the question, and that the less I can be interested in the answer, the more I find art in the literature. And it also, I think, protects against an arrogance to think, well, obviously today in 2022, sophisticated as we are with our iPhones, therefore we're asking these serious questions about the world. When you kind of realize that the authors who put together the very opening word of the opening sentence of the opening chapter of the opening book of the Bible, Bereshit bara Elohim, it starts with B. It should start with A. And so therefore they're saying there's sibling rivalry the whole way through this text. And A and B fight each other in the Midrash because the letter A is jealous. And you find in the book of Genesis over and over again that sibling pairs are fighting.
Always.
And so you see that these artists were speaking about infighting, about what to do about agriculture, what to do about what it means to be alive, inheritance, fighting, the question of real meaning. How do we govern each other? How do we hold each other together? What kind of leader do you want to be? What do you think of that man? What about the women? These questions are entirely present. And again, to reduce, I think, these literatures to the imagination of the worst demonstration of them in public life is to fail literature and to fail art, because these works are works of art and should be studied as such. I don't feel strongly about this at all.
Yes.
I'm thinking through a couple of, like, grabbing a couple of threads with folks in groups saying that the poem about the Troubles didn't have the F word enough, and Paul Celan's way of kind of dismembering German syntax. It's just making me think about embodiment in this space, and like it's something I'm interested in like how do you in your process and how has your idea changed about embodiment? What do you look for stylistically to how do you know when an idea has failed sufficiently at being embodied on the page?
What is your name?
I'm David.
Hi, David. Do you understand the question?
Well, I think you're asking about form and whether form can meet the function of a poem. Is that one of the things that's underneath that?
Yeah. So there's like the form, there's the requirement of your form in the moment of composition, but then there's also the requirements of history and its failures, right?
Yeah.
So there's kind of like a mangling that happens. And yeah, I'm just like wondering how much, it's one of those non-question questions, like how fucked up is your process?
Okay. Well, now I understand your question.
I mean, polysyllables.
Yeah. At the end of the year when Glenn died, some other people had died too, and I was. This is a tale of warning. I was backing up. I was upgrading my computer to a new operating system, and I backed it up to the iCloud, then I unsynced it so that it was all on the iCloud, so I could delete it from the computer and therefore upgrade the computer to whatever the next thing was. And I tried then to resync it, and everything was gone. Absolutely everything. 10 years of work, all gone. Every talk I'd given. The only way I had records of certain things was if I'd ever emailed them out, and they were I could go into Gmail. And I felt annoyed with myself because, I had been devastated by grief, but this was the one that just pushed me over the edge. And I would wake in the morning in a panic, and I'm not a panicky person. And these started with me with my eyes shut, writing them, typing them into the computer, into a computer that was now a blank document, a blank slate. I remember phoning you, and you said, could this be a relief? And I was like, not yet. No, definitely not. And I still go to get notes for something that I might be giving a talk on and go, oh, I know, I've got like 3 years of note. Oh, I don't. Yeah, all of these.
Well, Jesus is so alone. You're Joshua. You know, he's so alone. There's nobody with him. There's nobody. He doesn't think of anybody. He doesn't remember anybody. He has no memory.
He has none, yeah.
Like the blank computer.
Yeah. And I feel like that's one of the things that trauma does to us, and one of the processes of coming back into a certain sense of self is not to allow yourself to just be on the brink. That's why I didn't want it to end with, "Are you a bomb?" which is an Emily Dickinson reference, because she at one point talks about her soul, and she says she dances like a bomb abroad. And I suppose for me, there is a deep tenderness that begins to a sexual as well as interpersonal that emerges between Jesus and Persephone, and it really interests me to think about what does it mean to begin to accept consolation in a time where what had been was only devastation. And partly for me, it is about asking the question as an artist about being content to put something soothing into a poem. And I think, certainly maybe for me with my disposition, I kind of like scrunching things up. And what I've had to do, and this pushes me to the edge of my discomfort, is to find a way to represent human encounter in the poems in a way that is allowing to bring a little bit of resolution. Not everything's okay, but resolution in terms of human encounter. And this is a pathway back to happiness, a happy ending in a certain sense. And that, for me, is one of the forms that causes me deep discomfort, because it's the kind of thing that I would have thought is the repertoire of bad poetry, is to bring yourself back to a sense of resolution.
You know, as you're talking, I'm realizing there's eros between them.
Oh, God, yeah.
Not necessarily, and the eros is in her play with him, right? That she's making him deal with her intelligence, right? So he has to wake up a bit. He has to be more present with her. And if she was just like, oh, you've had such a hard time, oh, baby, I'm so sorry, she'd mothered him, right? Yeah. As so many women do wrongly, mother men. And if she had done that, but she was like, you know, but, you know, using her imagination. So he has to kind of, she's disenchanting him in some way.
She is, yeah. I mean, there are sex poems about them too, but I've only been married 2 days, so I don't know much about sex yet. And so I have to wait for a while before those poems emerge.
Well, she's having sex with a god down there.
Well, so is he with her.
Persephone.
Persephone is her mother is the goddess of agriculture, and Persephone is the granddaughter of time.
Yeah.
And so, like, they are these extraordinary characters. Kronos is her grandfather.
They're superpowers. They have
Completely.
superpower sex.
Yeah.
But yeah, her hell is not like his hell. Yeah.
Thank you so much for these poems. I was thinking about the way in which Persephone figures as, the figure who goes before and then who turns and both challenges, comforts, soothes. And I was wondering what he does for her. What is it that how does he come through her tunnel and surprise her? How is it that
So one of the things I think that to speak about these characters really as manifestations of trauma, when it comes to group encounter work, one of the things that can help in group encounter work is for people to meet somebody who share an experience with them, not necessarily professional, but who have simply been coping a little bit longer than they have. And that in itself is a benefit to the one who's in a fresh trauma, as well as a benefit to the one who's going, oh, it's not like anything's sorted, but I've been doing this for 3 years now, and that is it's a deep practice within trauma encounter work, is to create situations where people are able safely to support each other and then be supported externally as well. And that's one of the things that I think is happening in this dialogue between these two archetypes, is that in a certain sense, by her realizing how fresh this all is for her, she's realizing, or how fresh this all is for him, she's realizing actually how long she's come, and the sharing of that is beneficial to her, because she's not being dragged back into it, and she is able to speak something about the way without trying in any way to be a surrogate. So I think that's one of the things that's happening there.
I think we want to include the Zoom audience.
Oh yeah, can you? Hi, I'm Andrew. I'm just going to do Q&A from Zoom, but maybe you should do one more in the audience. Let me just get set up here.
Somebody else?
There was one over here somewhere, was there?
Same question? It's uncanny. Anybody else? The fellows, yeah.
Actually, can we repeat the last question that Sarah asked? Could you just?
Sarah, is that Sarah Blake back there?
Yeah.
Hello, Sarah.
Can you sort of summarize that question, Patrick?
Well, the question was what's in this for Persephone? What's she getting through this encounter? And I think it is about perspective here within the context of this. These are only a selection of some of them. There are many others too. But
do you have a question?
Yeah, here's a question. Do you write about not believing in heaven? Has trauma manifested that belief in you? And that question is from Liza.
So do I write about not believing in heaven? I mean, I think most of these poems are about not believing in heaven. Okay. They are about believing in hell. But yeah, I think that's what most of these are. It is, in a certain sense, to establish a republic of the imagination, where you're able to say that I'm not tied into the idea of anybody else's idea of heaven and hell, and to use these imaginations of place as a way of speaking about the here and now.
Great. Another one from online?
Sure.
How do you cultivate your imagination? Carolyn Carney.
That's a great question. You go.
Well, I read a lot, and I find it helpful to read and then to think about what would a good question be to ask about this particular text. So a couple of years ago, at the start of COVID, I read through the Epic of Gilgamesh in a few different translations, and then I found a reference, which is a Babylonian brilliant mythical poem, really. And it's about a despot king who's 2/3 God, and the gods decide to give him a best friend, a midlife crisis, and grief. Extraordinary. And it was originally written 4,000 years before the Common Era, and then it was updated 2,000 years before the Common Era. And I saw a reference in that to the Book of Exorcism, which is written in 2,000 years before the Common Era. So I found, through searching through, I found a copy of it. And I'm always up early, so I'd wake Paul up in the mornings with coffee and telling him about my latest discoveries in the Book of Exorcism. And so
there really is a Book of Exorcism?
It's a proto-medical text. It was an understanding that every physical manifestation, it was written in Babylon, that every physical manifestation was a demonstration of something that was being imposed by some outside unseen force. And so everything was to be exorcised. And partly what it is it's a demonstration of diagnostics, to try to figure out what's wrong and to try to imagine what might be causing it. And you see really there's certain magical thinking about it, but you also see profound intelligence of observation at work. And that's what I loved about it.
Well, that's what you have. I mean, the great thing about being friends with Pádraig is that we can talk about a minute, a couple of lines in one of the Gospels, and you see things and hear things I do not see and hear. Like the road, when they're saying, tell the little story about isn't it on the way to Gethsemane? Who's the greatest?
Oh yeah, what were you arguing about along the way?
Yeah, I never even got that. Like, just tell them.
I mean, this is all in conversation with the question about imagination, because for me it is about asking a question of a text and allowing your mind to go in a certain way. I had COVID over Christmas and I woke up in the middle of some kind of feverish dream with the idea of the death of Eve and wrote the first few stanzas and then went back to sleep. And partly it's because I'd been reading stuff, and I think that's what happens. We all know that. When you're reading stuff, you're in conversation with it to say, I wouldn't do it like that. And that's the beginning of imagination, to go, well, how would you do it? So like the text that Marie's talking about, there's this interesting text where Jesus of Nazareth is with his followers, and he says to them, what were you arguing about just there? And they're awkward because they've been arguing about who's the greatest. And I'm curious about what would the measurement of greatness have been? And what would that have been? And in a way that can seem like a silly text, but to go, well, what's the measurement of greatness amongst the fine art work fellows here?
Mm-hmm.
What's the measurement of greatness in fundraising?
Among sisters and brothers.
Among siblings. What's the measurement of greatness among any groups of people who are around each other where there's some level of competition? What's the measure of greatness in the question as to whether you did or didn't get this particular fellowship or accepted into this journal? What's the measurement of greatness that happens when you hear somebody being introduced and think, well, I have a different kind of introduction with that? And therefore this text isn't about the question about the kingdom of heaven. It's about saying these dynamics of trying to pay attention to how do you delineate yourself, the groups within the groups, and how do you measure greatness, and how is that a burden to you, and how is that your own torture, and is that how other people are measuring greatness? That's of interest to me in any grouping of people.
One of the most you've so many things, you've given me so many insights, but one of the ones I remember was you said in any group of 3 people there's conflict.
Of course.
And always quiet conflict. And then you also said, which has helped me so much, and I've told many, many people this, that often conflict cannot be resolved, but you can be in relationship with each other, and without having to resolve the conflict necessarily.
Yeah. And some conflicts shouldn't be resolved. I mean, that's
Right.
part of the exploration of Jesus and Persephone. They're in magnificent, electric conflict with each other, and I think there's deep affection and trust and imagination within the context of that. I think she is being characterized in these texts as somebody who has deep trust in her own process, and she isn't being drawn out of that by somebody who's frightened. And that's partly a way within which of trying to, in a certain sense, put the character of Jesus of Nazareth in a corner where he often was the one who was dictating to women whether they were or weren't. I mean, he had fascinating relationships with women for his time, but the public language about theology has often been that he's the one that brings purity to women or redemption or healing. Part of the entire depiction of Persephone in this is she's saying, I don't need anything that you can give me. And they're still in an equal and interesting relationship. And that, I think, is of interest to the possibility of the power and the electricity and the potential of conflict. Other conflicts, not everything needs to be resolved. And then in a different conversation, not everything can be resolved. And the question is, well, what are you going to do with it?
Do we have another?
Sure. In the series, this question's from Jonathan Abel. In the series, the poems sounded like they're all in the voice of Jesus. Are there others where the first person is Persephone?
Well, they're all in the voice of an outside narrator. Yeah, okay. He said, she said, yeah.
Gotcha.
So there is somehow a narrator who is fairly distant. I mean, the narrator doesn't become any kind of a character within it and is simply trying to observe. Yeah, I mean, there's the one about Persephone speaking about prayer and echoing down the long corridors. And yeah, that's a little reference to Gilgamesh. In Gilgamesh, when you are on a journey and you're wanting to give libation to the gods are underneath, and so you pour water into the earth in the hope that it'll trickle down to the gods underneath and that they'll be able to drink the water. So yeah.
Anybody else here? Comments, questions? Yeah.
More about form and the relationship to the sort of shift from belief to encounter, either just the way that your work has changed as your sort of relationship to belief has changed, or also if there are texts, visual texts, religious texts, poetic texts that you feel sort of live in encounter more than belief.
You guys ask complicated questions.
Are you able to repeat that for the audience or
Yeah,
summarize that?
can you say that just one more time for maybe just one question?
I'll try to go plug in there. More comprehensible. Just a question about how has the change in your belief, how it has moved towards sort of faith of encounter, changed your relationship to form and craft?
I'm not sure it has. Like I really benefited from the Irish education system, where from the age of 5 we were learning poems off by heart in 2 languages every week, one in English, one in Irish. And your final exams at 15 and 18, you're expected to know 80 poems off by heart in each language, to quote them in your essays and to then discuss them in terms of giving critical thought. And so for me, the question of poetry as art and form and the question of belief have never been opposite to each other. And so, I mean, a significant percentage of the Hebrew Bible is poetry. And so form for me has always been the container of chaos and a way within which you can explore chaos through form. And I think I've learnt that from Hebrew poetry, rather than had to separate myself from belief in order to experience that. I'm probably an agnostic. I'm in the room next door to belief, but I love the stories, and I'm moved by the questions they ask. And I think I'm part of a huge majority of people who have an affiliation to a religious belief who are in that very same situation. I don't in any way feel like I'm doing something unique with this. I feel like there's enormous amounts of people who take the texts and the traditions and the prayers and use them as a certain form to bring comfort. And the question as to whether they're existentially provable or not is irrelevant. The question is does it give shape to a life? And does it give shape to community? And I suppose that's what I'm thinking when I hear your question about the question of form and belief and their relationship to each other. Yeah.
Do you still feel like a failure? And if so, how do you live with it?
You don't have to answer that one, Pádraig.
What's that?
You don't have to answer that one.
No, I think it's a real question. Yeah, I do. I mean, yeah, I often feel like, I fall in between a variety of words, I don't believe enough to belong to a group of theologians. I often feel like the subject matter that I engage with in poetry is seen to be naive by some communities of poets. And I often feel very alone in the context of that and feel like, you submit things and people go, these are extraordinary, but we don't want them. No. And that's just, that's part of the course. And that's just about the small thing about submitting when it comes to the question of poetry and journals. I think on a bigger sense of failure, there's all kinds of ways within which I think to grow up in the systemics of a fairly homophobic environment, culturally and religiously, that gets into you like a virus, and you learn it quickly, and it's hard to get rid of. And I don't think LGBTQI people are unique in that. I think there's lots of us. For all the reasons that we've been told to be ashamed of ourselves, that it can be hard to move away from that. And I suppose I've learned to be more comfortable with speaking like that, because I think there's a lot of company.
Yeah. Yes.
I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for Poetry Unbound.
Mhm.
I'd say particularly in the first year of the pandemic, it was like being thrown a little life buoy once a week in that time of isolation and anxiety, to be invited to think about things entirely outside ourselves and introduce, to all those poets, and have your very soothing voice analyze it. And thank you. It was a real service.
And I turned her on to it.
Yeah, she did.
That's very kind. Thank you.
I would just like to say that I really, truly love you.
Thank you.
Andrew, can you repeat that back for Zoom? I think it's worth hearing twice.
Yeah, the question was, thank you for Poetry Unbound. And then another audience member said that she loves Pádraig.
Everybody, you can just go to anywhere you get your podcasts and ask for Poetry Unbound, and you can hear them all, right?
All free.
They last about how long?
15 minutes.
15?
Yeah.
It seems shorter.
12
actually.
to, well, some of them are shorter, 12 to 15.
Pádraig reads a poem, and he chooses the most amazing poems, really, and then talks about it, but in a way that is very unusual, don't you think? How would you describe it, how he talks about the poem?
Your analysis and interpretation sometimes, for me, is breathtakingly beautiful, even more so than the poem.
Oh, she really does love you.
Well,
You want to marry him.
well,
No, it's true, but it's not, you don't go at it literary criticism, but it's this wonderful, it's the same way he reads the texts of the Bible, there's a really close reading that's really opens it up to this wonderful way. Does somebody back there want to say something? No?
I mean,
Poetry
one of the things for me about, and thank you very much for those kind comments. There's a lot of work, yeah, but it's a joy to do, and thank you for those kinds of comments. Like for me, the joy of having the opportunity to read a text of a poem and to reflect on it and read it twice and to make those programs, as well as to receive a text of a religious tradition, as well as to look at a text of a constitution, or to look at a text of what people are trying to come to in terms of conflict resolution, or to look at the text of, for instance, an absolute failure like Brexit in terms of civic public language, and then to compare that to the text of the Good Friday Agreement, which I think is 25 years old this week. And all of that for me is an interest in the power of words. And one of the things that I think people, I suppose I'm specifically speaking to people who use words as their art, is to think about there is a public power in language. And not that every poem has to be constitutional, but I'm interested in weighing the power of language in terms of what it can do in public. And I look for language to do work in public, and I really hope it can, because if it can't, we're in trouble. And we have seen not the imagination that the last 6 years is a particular decimation, I think, is a short reading of history.
Yeah.
There's centuries, unfortunately, of terror to read when it comes to the failure of language. I think one of the things that we can try to do is to try to hold out for the power of words used well in public, and knowing that they can create or destroy worlds if they're used poorly. And that, I think, is what I hope language can mean in public. And tenderness is part of that, and comfort and kindness, as well as challenge, finding ways to create houses for vehicles for public language is, I think, a vocation for anybody working in language. Not that you need to commodify your art, but that we are seeking something like integrity in what we do.
How's our time?
It's 8:17.
I think we have to.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
This question has come in twice from the same person, so I want to get this in. But Pádraig mentioned that he is getting a PhD in poetry and prayer. I'm wondering what advice you would give to aspiring poets considering a path in academia.
Oh, Lord.
Oh,
and
Lord.
also the prompt,
Yeah.
Pádraig.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I'm not looking to get a job in academia. I suppose I'm self-employed, so I'm interested in learning. And so there was an opportunity to do a creative PhD, writing a book of poetry and then engaging with the broader thought around that. So mostly I think I have no good advice because I don't know. Any study that I've done because I'm interested in the study. And to pursue what you're interested in, I think, is because it's your imagination that will need to sustain you, you know. And I think that that's something to consider. I don't know what's going to happen with it. I don't even know if I'll get it. My God, you know, I might fail, you know. But the question is for me, if I got told you haven't been successful in this, to go, what would I do with that? To go, well, I'm glad I learned what I did. And for me, that's the curiosity about learning within it. I think every poet I've spoken to who's an academic speaks wisely about the way within which to understand that there is your art, and then there's the way that you might be feeling cornered in the way that you have to use your art. And there are so many wise people who write about that and speak about that. I would say that that's a conversation that you'll find manifested by many poets who are also academics, because it's not to say that those two things are necessarily against each other, but it can be hard to feel nurtured in both, I suppose. Time is always a demand.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The prompt.
So the prompt, I suppose, is to think about any narrative that you have that has shaped you. You know, that could be something from Tolkien, that could be Ursula Le Guin, it could be mythologies, it could be religious texts, and to think about a minor character in that, and to just describe something that minor character sees.
And let's just put in a word for it's never too late. If you don't know the Greek myths, you can learn them now.
I mean, I'm not knowledgeable about the Greek myths. I started to read them during lockdown. I started to knit and I started to learn the Greek myths. And I started by getting children's books of the Greek myths with pictures.
Dolores. Dolores. That's the great book.
Yeah.
Get that book. It's a great book.
Yeah. It was so helpful because, just doing it like that. And then I read another version, and then I started to read translations of things. And just having the broad overview was so helpful, and then to go deeper and deeper. But I mean, I always would think that finding a version that's a children's version and one that is rated well by parents who say, my kids love these, you go, great, fantastic. And then that really helped me. And I mean, they're bewildering, these myths. And so therefore you just kind of go down the rabbit hole that you like and forget the rest, because there's plenty of other time to do other explorations. And I think they're designed to gather your projection. So you'll always find somebody that you either love or loathe enough to follow your imagination, whether in any mythology, in any religious text. They're all archetypes that are being manifested, and it's magnificent.
They all live within us.
Yeah, because they came from us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Pádraig, I want to thank you for coming to the Fine Arts Work Center.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marie.
Please join me in giving Marie Howe and Pádraig Ó Tuama the largest round of applause for bringing wonder and curiosity and joy to all of us tonight. I glanced briefly at the Zoom chat, and I just want to say that there, in all caps, people were screaming, "More poems, please." So thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We hope to see you next week on Thursday for Ada Limon and Nick Flynn. Thank you.